Hello and good afternoon. I'm your host Abdulrahim Kashur, and this is the L24 daily special coverage. Today's focus will be on Ukraine's latest, as well as Germany's new settlements to face the inflation. Russia shelling killed 4 Ukrainian civilians in Donetsk province over the weekend, offering a grim reminder of the continuous battle in the country's east, even as the war's focus has shifted to the south. On the other side of Europe, the German government announced a $65 billion relief package on Sunday to help ease the burden on citizens facing soaring inflation and surging energy costs that have worsened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and have sent European leaders scrambling to prepare the continent for winter. Likewise, the newly elected UK Prime Minister Liz Truss, who promised to find a solution to the inflation as soon as she is elected. Still in Germany, where the German-based political and economic think tank Schiller Institute, founded by Helga Zebler-Rusch. This institute is collaboration between sister organizations registered in 5 countries: USA, Germany, France, Denmark, and Sweden. The institute's state aim is to apply to ideas of the poet and philosopher Friedrich Schiller to what it calls the contemporary world crisis. But in the late August, a Ukrainian hit list comes to the scene, targeting most of the Schiller Institute members and other world politicians whom they think and provide solutions different from ones of the Western leaders, whom they keep sending weapons to Ukraine and imposing illogical sanctions on Russia. To analyze all this information, I'm joined by Mr. Halli Schlenger, Vice President of the Schiller Institute from Germany, and Gregory Simons, Associated Professor and Researcher at Uppsala University and Lecturer at the Department of Communication Science from Sweden. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us in this debate. A short break and we will be back. And before we delve into discussion, let's tackle this story. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy claimed battlefield successes during his forces' counteroffensive against Russian troops in occupied southern region of Kherson. Zelenskyy thanked soldiers for taking 2 settlements in the south, along with additional territory in the east, citing good reports from his military commanders and intelligence chief. Mr. Halli, based on this information given, the Ukrainian president claims that his army gained back couple territories. In your opinion, what is the situation now in Ukraine?
Well, according to military experts I've been in touch with in the United States, this counteroffensive is going nowhere. It doesn't have enough forces. The Russians are prepared for it, and the Russians are succeeding in turning it back. This is designed for Western consumption, to convince people that the money that's being spent and the weapons that are being sent to Ukraine is having an effect. It's not. There's no way Ukraine can win this war. Now, when I say that, I'm charged with being an information terrorist for realistically assessing the fact that even with all the weapons being poured in and the money, it's not enough to win a war, and what's needed is a negotiated settlement. But instead, the Zelenskyy government is continuing to beg for money, put pressure on governments for money, demand more sanctions against Russia, regardless of the cost to the citizens that are doing that. So I think that there needs to be a pause. People need to take a step back and realize that the real information terrorists are the ones who are predicting a Ukraine victory and are demanding continued support for their efforts.
Very good indeed. A point taken. Mr. Simons, what is your reading in the situation there? I mean, is Ukraine coming back as Zelenskyy promised last month? We will take back even the Crimea, not only the lands here in Ukraine, but we will take back everything that belonged to us. Do you think that his army is capable of these promises?
It kind of reminds me of the closing phases of the Second World War when Hitler was planning all these different counter-offensives to take everything back against the Red Army. And of course, these are empty words, as this is. If we look at how Ukraine uses military operations are supporting information operations, not the other way around. Russia is using information operations to support military operations, but Ukraine has the other way round because they're militarily weaker, they're losing the war, and if the support dries up, which it's starting to do so because this policy is starting to affect, and it's going to affect much more, the lives of civilians outside of Ukraine, then the war will be over much more quickly. The US is keeping this war going, not because of sovereignty and these lovely humanitarian questions of independence and so forth. They're doing it, they've openly said. They're stoking this war to weaken and contain Russia. This is the sum of it. Very cynical geopolitics.
Very good indeed. Mr. Harley, coming back to you, Russia has been called by more than 42 countries to withdraw its troops from the nuclear power plant. So how can you explain these calls when one of the main reasons why Russia launched this military operation in the first place was to get their hands on these nuclear plants? I mean, why they can't call the Ukrainian authorities to stop shelling over that and try a peaceful talk of a nuclear facility, which is the logical and the most rational solution to this dilemma?
Well, I think the answer to that is fairly straightforward. Russia did not move into Ukraine to take over the nuclear plant. They moved into Ukraine to knock out the neo-Nazi movement within the Ukrainian security and defense forces and to stop NATO from expanding eastward. Those have been their goals from the start. The Western media is trying to make you think that the Russians are trying to take over all of Ukraine, that the Ukrainians are heroically defending their territory, and so on. Now, the question of the nuclear plant, I think we'll hear from, hopefully, from the International Atomic Energy Agency that the Russians are not the ones shelling the plant, that it's the Ukrainians shelling the plant, and the danger is coming from what Ukraine is trying to do. Now, similarly, when it comes to the energy situation in Western Europe, it's the Europeans who forced the shutdown of Russian oil and gas by their sanctions policy and their attacks on Russia. So without going any further on this, the point is that what the professor was saying is absolutely true. There's an information war being conducted against people in the West. Now, many people in the transatlantic region believe it because they're not hearing an alternative. But most of the rest of the world is either neutral or in support of the Russians in this situation. And that's something that is a complete shock to Western leaders who think that they control the world through the unipolar order. The rest of the world is moving in a different direction. And we see it in terms of this nuclear plant. Russia's trying to keep the plant running, and the Ukrainians are willing to risk something bigger than Chernobyl in order to make the point that Russia is the big bad threat to the whole world.
Very interesting points you have raised, as always, Mr. Halley. Mr. Simons, do you think the latest visit by the IAEA inspectors will secure the nuclear facility of Zaporizhzhia from a further shelling?
Well, not necessarily, because when they arrived, they were interfered with. And, of course, you had that case of that commando raid that was alleged, which was prevented, which the IAEA did not deny. I mean, they were trying to be diplomatic, but, I mean, they are a bargaining chip in this as far as Ukraine is concerned. And this is something they made clear from the moment they arrived in Ukraine and attempted to cross the contact zone between Ukrainian-controlled territory and Russian-controlled territory. So this is something which they're using to negotiate harder with very dangerous tactics, as has been already stated.
Quite understood. Now moving on away from Ukraine to tackle the second point. There were a list of names that comes out full of analysts and politicians whom they have different ideas and explanation over backing up Ukraine with weapons and funding, such as those speakers of Schiller Institute looking for a better solution beyond the war in Ukraine. These names are considered to Ukraine government as Russian propaganda agents, declaring them to be information terrorists and threatening legal and other action as war criminals. Likewise, Helga Zeplarouche, founder of the Schiller Institute, and the Danish MP Marie Karup, and so many others in different countries. Mr. Halley, these names were considered as promoters of Russian narrative. So what are you saying about this, since you are the vice president of this institution, and were you listed in this hit list?
Yes, my name is the 8th name on the list. Out of the initial list of 72 names, Mrs. LaRouche was the second name. Diane Sayre was on the list. A number of my direct associates, as well as a total of 30 people who spoke at Schiller Institute conferences. And what were they talking about? They were talking about how to end the war. They were talking about how the suffering of the people of Ukraine is the result of the Ukrainian government's delusional belief that they can defeat Russia in a war. And more importantly, that they're continuing the war because the West is funding it for the intention of weakening Russia. So for saying such things, which are truthful, I'm labeled an information terrorist and a war criminal. And the threat is very real because the Mirotvorets organization, which is connected to the Committee to Combat Disinformation, has a hit list, a target list. And Daria Dugina, who was murdered by a car bomb 10 days ago in Moscow, was on that list. There have been a number of people on that list who have been killed. And we're calling on Western governments to follow through on their initial actions to condemn this keeping of lists and condemn this attempt to silence debate. At one point, there were 4,000 journalists on the list. Everyone who had spent time in Ukraine as a journalist was put on that list. People like Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector, and so on. So this is a threat, and this is being done by the so-called democracies because the money to fund this is not coming from the Ukrainian government, it's coming from Western governments. And just 3 days ago, on the 1st and 2nd of September, the Committee to Combat Disinformation had another conference where there were representatives from 24 countries there, and the leader of this organization, Shapovalov, reiterated that people who are on this list are war criminals and should be indicted in tribunals and treated with adequate remedy, including the death penalty. None of the 24 governments that were there, including the US, the German, and others, protested this operation. And so here we see the reality of the Western commitment to democracy and freedom, trying to silence people who are calling for dialogue and an end to war and negotiations.
It's really the ugly truth. I have been in contact with the Schiller Institute's members since the beginning of this war and this operation, and they only say the ugly truth, that the Western media is playing a role in this war. Unfortunately, Mr. Simons, you have already an idea on this list since last time you participated with me. So anyone, in your opinion, against or even neutral over the Ukraine government in this war is considered as a war criminal and a Russian narrative promoter. So you are in Sweden. If you are not backing up Ukraine, I mean, you are not even with Russia, but it means you are a war criminal. How can you explain this?
Well, I mean, it's Orwellian if you look at it in this way, because anyone that is either neutral or balanced, that this kind of moderate behaviour is marked extremist, and this is weird. And I mean, as has already been noted, the fact that the EU did not even register a complaint, let alone shut it down, this Mirotvorets is on a NATO server. It's not even on a Ukrainian government server, it's on a NATO server. So one has to ask, where is the general data protection regulation when it comes to that? It was openly calling for the killing of citizens within the EU, giving their personal data. Nothing. And these empty slogans about rule of law or respect for human rights and civil liberties is just proving utterly hollow. And so what we're having here, extremism has become the new normal, the acceptable, and anyone who is not in this extremist cult, I would refer to it as, is to be liquidated. And further, when we're talking about Daria Dugina, after she was murdered, on the Meritorious website, they put a little cross over her photo to mark that she had been killed. So, I mean, what these EU and the Western governments are supporting is something which is beyond the pale.
It's very good. You have what you have said, Mr. Hawley, as a member in this Schiller Institute. I mean, isn't it really risky now? You do have a family. What are you thinking about to do as a solution?
Well, the only solution is to expose the corruption behind this and to put pressure on governments that if anything were to happen to people on the list, they bear responsibility. At the same time, we have to inoculate the public to this psychological warfare that's being thrown at them. And you know, here we see what I consider the real crime. I'm sure many people heard these comments by the German foreign minister, who's a strong supporter of this war, Annalena Baerbock. She said that the war will continue, Germany will continue to arm Ukraine, and she said, I don't care what my German voters think. Well, is this democracy? That they're going to continue the war, they're going to silence opposition, they're going to censor the news stories? You know, this is what we're dealing with, a complete breakdown of what is supposedly the Western tradition. And why is it happening? Because the West is in a profound crisis, an economic crisis, a strategic crisis. And Russia and China and other nations, including many nations of the South like India, Brazil, Argentina, Algeria among them, South Africa, don't want to go along with the so-called rules-based order because the rules are for the rich countries and the wealthiest people in the world who take advantage of other countries, and any country that tries to break with that is threatened with regime change and war. So for me, you know, I'm going to continue to speak out. We're taking certain kinds of legal measures. We're going to file complaints in governments. But especially, we're demanding of the U.S. Congress, in the case of the Americans on the hit list, we're demanding that the Congress cut the funding to Ukraine until this agency is shut down. And I think other governments should do the same, because the toleration of a kill list put out by a group that includes within it neo-Nazis and terrorists is unacceptable. And hopefully this message will get across to people in the U.S. Congress.
We all hope this is really serious, and inshallah something good will be appear. Now, moving on to German government has approved a new package of measures of 65 billion euros to help citizens and companies combat high inflation, as news of the new Nord Stream pipeline shutdown hit the markets, causing a 20% energy prices jump.
Wir werden die Zeit bis dahin überstehen.
We will last out until then, because we've made some decisions in the last few months to store gas, put coal-fired plants back in service. And that's why we can now say that we can deal with this winter.
Jetzt und an dieser Stelle sagen, wir werden durch diesen Winter kommen.
Since you are in Germany, I'll be staying with you, Mr. Hawley. In your analysis, Mr. Hawley, now how Germany is going to face this energy shortage and inflation? I mean, why would they put themselves in this situation by pushing Russia to its limit to cut gas supplies? They couldn't even manage to find alternatives such as Italy, but they kept the strong standing against Russia. Don't you think the Germans now are going to pay their government's debts?
Well, unfortunately, I think Germany is functioning as a continuing occupied country. The policies of the German government are dictated from London and Wall Street. And the idea that the Germans should suffer because of this war and then to blame it on Putin shows the ultimate hypocrisy. And this government, there was a poll out the other day that showed that only 29% of Germans think the present government is competent. The economics minister said that what's going to happen with industry is alarming. Then they blame it on Putin. But the reality is it's neoliberal economic policies, it's the sanctions, and it's the green policies of the European Union, which are creating the shortages and creating the crisis. There are easy solutions to it. Stop the war. Stop shutting down industry and energy production, adequate, efficient energy production. Stop shutting it down. But instead of doing that, they're going along with ideological demands that are coming largely from London and Wall Street. And one of the things we've done at the Schiller Institute is publish reports on the conferences that are going on, talking about why we need fewer people in the world, and the use of the so-called climate change policies is one way to get it.
Understood. Mr. Simons, we all know that Russia is using the energy sector as a leverage or even as a weapon against all European countries, as they are claiming. But do you think there is another solution for Russia to avoid sanctions by not using its energy card? I believe this is the only key to fight back these sanctions.
Well, I mean, the sanctions which have been imposing are self-destructive because, I mean, they're sanctioning themselves, the EU, effectively. I mean, as is noted, I mean, Germany has moved from being a vassal state to a client state, I would say. I mean, Merkel was bad, but I mean, Schultz, I mean, my goodness, he's just atrocious. There is no semblance of any kind of independence. Now, I mean, these crises and problems began even before the war. The war has exacerbated them. But I mean, the stupid ideologically based policy is not the way to go forward. And I think one thing which the Europeans have not noticed, they are no longer the prime market for Russian energy supplies. That is elsewhere. And I mean, this is in keeping with what has already been noted by Harvey. That's you got this global trend underway, moving away from this Western-centric world, this US unipolar order, towards a non-Western-centric multipolar order. The Europeans and the US, this Western-centric powers, they're not prepared for this change. They're trying to fight it, but what they're doing is actually ensuring the decline accelerates. And so, I mean, given the quality, if we dare call it that, of Western leadership, I mean, it's not going to be too long before the collapse, especially when you have leaders which are objectively working against the interests of their own citizens.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Now, let's move to tackle the last point, so we do have a limited time. British Foreign Minister Liz Truss said on Sunday that she would announce within a week action to tackle rising energy bills and increase energy supplies if she is, as expected, appointed Prime Minister on Monday. And now she has been officially elected to be the new Prime Minister.
That if I'm elected as Prime Minister, within 1 week, I will make sure there is an announcement on how we are going to deal with the issue of energy bills and of long-term supply to put this country on the right footing for winter. I will act immediately on bills and on energy supply because I think those two things go hand in hand. We need to deal with the immediate problem. We need to help people. We need to help businesses. But we also need to sort out the supply issues that have made us end up being where we are now.
How can you consider the words of Mr. Harley? How can you consider the words of Liz Truss? She is saying, if I am winning the seat, I have a solution to the crisis of energy supplies. I mean, is this only the typical promises of the politicians, or there is a solution to the crisis?
There's a solution to the crisis, but she's not the solution. She's part of the problem. You know, she was one of the most avid supporters of the war. one of the people pushing hardest for the sanctions against Russia. She was hand in hand with Boris Johnson in doing that. She's been a supporter of the idea from the United States that Russia must be weakened. She's also committed to the idea of global Britain, which means sending the British military into the Asian theater as part of their operations, and also part of NATO's operations moving into Africa. So the idea that she's going to do something to change this is completely absurd. The amount of money that's needed by the average family in Great Britain is much larger than the few pennies they're going to put in their direction. They're having an average of loss of between 5 and 10% of consumption per household. The inflation rate is expected to hit 20% by the end of the year in the United Kingdom. And where are they going to get their energy from? So she's just presenting usual politicians' talking points, but her policy is to continue the wars and the austerity against the British people. Now, we're seeing strikes throughout the population in the United Kingdom, as we are with taxi drivers in Italy, farmers throughout Europe. I think we're in for a really hot autumn this year in Europe, and I think the solution is stop the war, move toward a new financial architecture, which is based not on the City of London, Wall Street, and Brussels, but based on the actual needs of sovereign nations that can be negotiated for mutual benefit. Liz Truss is not going to do that. She's an operative for the City of London.
Great, understood. Mr. Simons, if there is a solution, as she is claiming, it means only one thing. Either the European governments are lying to their people, putting more pressure on the Russians, that they are the main reason behind inflation, or she is playing on the sensitive nerve to win the post. And she did. She won. What are you saying about this?
Liz Truss is the meeting point of two quaint English sayings. One is, the lights are on but nobody is home. And the second saying is, empty vessels make much noise. She is not equipped intellectually for this. And she has no manoeuvre to actually satisfy what she talks about. I mean, it's pure populism, what she's doing. Empty slogans and expecting people to buy it. When there's electricity shortages, no heating, food is through the roof, and you've got all of these shortages and crises coming together in the winter, where will she be? She's going to be nowhere to be seen. So, this is window dressing, but at a very primitive, populistic level.
Very good indeed. A couple minutes left. Mr. Hawley, the floor is yours. What is your expectation for the coming days between Russia and Ukraine and the newly elected Prime Minister? What role she will be playing right now?
She figures out that she has no economic policy that will work. She'll follow Boris Johnson's footsteps to Kiev to present herself as the great hero of democracy. And I think people are beginning to see through this. The real question in Europe is, will people move behind an alternative? And what the Schiller Institute repeatedly does is put forward economic policies that are alternatives based on the idea of breaking with the unipolar order and having multilateral negotiations and benefits. So development is what's necessary. Liz Truss is not going to do it. The government of Germany, unfortunately, is going to continue to take orders from London and Wall Street. And so a lot of our hopes for improvement in the world come from Russia, China, and the global South. And I think that's a hard lesson for people in Western Europe, but it's one they're going to have to come to terms with.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Simons, couple of words for you. What is your expectation as well?
It's pretty grim as well. I mean, the West is ruled by the US. It has no independence, the EU. And they're pursuing policies that are utterly self-destructive. And, I mean, these so-called leaders which are coming up, are absolutely superfluous. I mean, everything could run without them and would probably run better without them. So, as has been said, I mean, leadership lies elsewhere than the Western-centric world at the moment. That is nothing more than a self-destructive messianic cult.
Thank you so much, Mr. Simon. Mr. Howley, thank you ever so much always for your presentation with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much also for being with us. And for now, all I can say, take care of yourself. Have a blessed day.